Welcome to start of day 2 of Transform. I would like to introduce our 2 guests here. We have Georgia Warren-Meyers, who's Head of Sustainability Strategic Value Advisory Global at JLL. And we have Julian Sutherland, Head of Sustainable Assets, APAC. All right, so we are talking about exploring climate risk at scale. So we're going to talk a little bit about asset management, how the industry is progressing. So from your perspective, how are you seeing the conversation around climate-related portfolio risk? How has it evolved over the last, say, 5 years or so? And do you think the asset management industry is responding at the right pace, essentially?
Well, I think we've seen quite an escalation. So we saw the banking sector kind of go through some of that, I suppose, recognition with the floods and the fires that were happening in the late teens, but you also TCFD kind of, come into action and start having and being picked up by different organisations who are forward thinking about this particular element. And so we've kind of moved forward to where we've got the Australian Sustainability Reporting Standards that has kind of supercharged this particular aspect in the Australian context. And we're really starting to see that shift in mindset of, okay, well, hang on a sec. When we had those kinds of risks, I wasn't aware of those risks. And we're now starting to see that information also flowing up to board level and in that decision-making space. And I think that's a really great step forward. It will be interesting now that we've got the reporting happening, what level of action is then taken around those particular risks.
Yeah, I think so the whole idea of asset protection really does start at that portfolio level, although I'm a buildings person, so I can talk about it at an asset level easily, but actually it starts at portfolio level, really understanding what are the risks across all of those assets and looking to find the common elements as well as the individual elements. And I think looking at it at this highest level allows you to set the strategy in place that then can play all the way down through into different assets. I think we understand the perils associated with climate risk quite well. And I guess what we need to do is really, I think we do recognise that these things are playing out all around us. Actually just sitting in Sydney for the last couple of weeks, we had wildfires on North Sydney on Monday, which completely blanketed the city in smog. And then a couple of weeks ago, we had yachts on the rocks because there was a big blast of wind down the harbour on the Sunday afternoon. And then I think Tuesday night, we had record amounts of rain in North Sydney, Mosman, 95 millimetres in one night. And now these are like little local events, let alone the sort of national events that we see. So I think, we're planning for a future event, but actually these things are here and now. And so we really need to get on with this. But yeah, having a plan through from portfolio to asset level is really important, because then you've got a structure on which to understand what to do, when to do it, and how to do it.
Yeah. So these impacts are becoming very real. Where have you seen the most improvement with your clients over the last 5 years or so in how assets are responding or portfolios responding to that climate risk?
Well, I'd probably say this is, kind of also engaging back with my good old academic days. But, I did a lot of work a number of years ago that we're kind of looking at, and I'll link to Bronwyn King's kind of comment yesterday about divestment being a really bad word, and that property investors, developers don't want to hear that word. And so we were talking back then about, climate risk and how this was then going to, drive different decisions within portfolios, and would that lead to divestment of risky or perceived risky assets? I think we've also got, there's an element, I think, don't say the word divestment because no one likes that one. I think there's more strategic choice in terms of what's happening in the portfolios instead. But I'm also seeing a number of opportunities emerging as well. So there's positive stories in terms of, okay, all right, it's got a risk. It's not, oh my God, this asset's going to be wiped out kind of thing. It's like, okay, so what can we do? And looking at different measures in terms of what can actually solve the issue for the asset and then make it more resilient. Now, that ranges from really simple things like flood covers to basement levels to really complex kind of adaptation measures. But we're also starting to see success stories over in Hong Kong where they have the black rains and the typhoons and things like that. Link REIT have been successful in terms of putting in a whole range of adaptation measures that has then led to a reduction in their insurance premium for one of their severely affected assets.
Mm-hmm. And at the asset level, maybe?
Yeah, I guess we see a lot of work around, I guess, the obvious ones around flood. I mean, it's the sort of biggest, it's to some extent the easiest one to get a hold of. So flood mitigation, surface water runoff, precipitation. It's also got quite a lot of well understood solutions and swales and elevation and lifting your ground floor up. And actually, it's probably the one we tackle the most. Although it's also quite difficult because we are trying to put in place solutions to random events. We can plan for certain rainfalls, we can plan for certain intervals, but actually these events are likely to exceed that or operate in a different way, or the rain comes with wind and all these sorts of different complexities. So it is a combination of physical mitigation and management as well, because you can only make the physical asset so resilient. There's a point at which that randomness has to be tackled by people and management and taking action. Getting the flood covers in place soon enough is a people action and management action. So how do you know when to do those sorts of things? So it's definitely really important that those two things come together, the physical and the management, and then actually understanding how all that plays and actually testing those systems as well. There's no point having them if no one knows that they're hidden in a design report somewhere on the shelf in the as-builts. You've actually got to get those items out into the real world, run some scenarios, do some testing. We see that happening in sort of big critical buildings like data centers where there's really well-established operational management plans. That's really best practice. And we probably need to take some of that into normal commercial assets so that we know how to react, because you've only got a certain amount of time.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, and then there's a sort of precinct approach versus asset level as well. Like it's no good having a resilient asset as an island in a flooded precinct which you can't access.
Yes, correct.
It does get quite complex.
Yeah, and if you've got a major flood event, the building might be fine, but actually people probably can't get to work. And we're quite lucky now that a lot of people can work from home, which is probably quite a nice mitigation method, but not everybody can do that. So large logistics facilities rely on people being able to get to the building. The building might be fine, but if you can't get to it, you've got to deal with it. So that becomes part of how quickly do we get back to normal? What's that likely to look like?
But we've also got more long-standing transaction evidence from our cap markets team where shopping centre was absolutely fine, not in a flood zone, but when it was taken to market, basically because the catchment zone and the primary market area that is serviced by that shopping centre was severely affected by flood risk zone 1, it saw a 75 basis point chip to the price. So, we're already seeing elements of climate risk being priced into the market.
Yeah. We've also got, when we look at the sort of regulatory context that we're in as well, we're seeing, the increase in reporting requirements, ASRS, mandatory disclosures. We've got, investors asking, I think, increasingly sophisticated questions around particularly resilience. So, as, part of a global network of rating tool owners, we know investors are coming to us and asking for, more and more information, particularly around resilience, and they want to see language harmonized across global rating tools and metrics that are real and actionable and comparable across jurisdictions as well. So with that sort of increased reporting, benchmarking sort of requirements on asset owners, are you seeing this driving real genuine risk identification? Or are we seeing that sort of compliance first, insight second dynamic with increased reporting?
I like the reporting. I think the reporting is great because the reporting drives awareness and it puts it straight up to the C-suite with a really big number attached to it. And C-suites respond to large numbers. And that's great. So that then, of course, cascades down into, well, what are we going to do about minimizing this big number? So I think that's great. And I think because you need to have support at all levels to undertake these projects. As a designer, when you come to the table with solutions and ideas, And you go, well, we could do this to protect this building. Someone's going to say, why, how, what? And we go, well, there, because you want to avoid that $3 million loss. That kind of changes the discussion quite quickly. And because these things are expensive solutions typically, you know, managing the height of a building, the landscaping, huge amounts of water retention, they're expensive items. So they need to have expensive consequences to really make people understand why you do them. So I think it's great. I think the reporting's great. And the more it becomes standardized, the better, because then we all can see things in the same way and we're not kind of worrying about all the differences between the numbers and things. It's like the consistency is really good.
But in terms of kind of connecting with thinking about, you know, frameworks and, you know, equalisation across countries and things like that in terms of what is defined as resilience, and being able to, you know, easily kind of just say, oh, you know, it's got a resilience certification or something. That's not that easy. Buildings are really quite specific. They've got very specific challenges. And whilst a lot of the climate risk elements are kind of dealt with in kind of separate little buckets, you know, when you've got multiples all kind of happening at the same time, there's an escalation in terms of what can happen, and also the randomness. So when you look to Spain and Valencia, where they had the flash floods last year, none of the climate risk forecasts or even the local forecasting ever forecast that those areas would be flooded.
Yeah, it's a really good example,
So,
I think. Yeah.
you know, we've still got that randomness per se that we need to be thinking about, not just if it pops up on a risk sheet saying, oh, yes, you know, it's at risk of flood. I think we should be thinking more structurally about resilience in all assets, because we don't necessarily know when these things are going to happen or where.
So do you think with all of this reporting and requirements, are we seeing that translating into sort of genuine action? I mean, I think I agree. It's great that we're measuring, benchmarking, understanding. Are we then seeing that flowing through quickly enough into, you know, actual outcomes?
Oh, I guess nothing ever seems to happen quick enough. You know, we're probably going to see a few more consequences before, I guess, it really accelerates. I think that's inevitable. But I think, you know, with new buildings and new assets, we can see that people are already on the journey, and that, you know, design codes are being updated. The issues of resilience are being built in. It's much easier at that point to do this, and I think that's happening, which is great. It's the existing assets where it's much more difficult. I mean, you can't just pick up a 45-story building and lift it a metre. You could try, but I think it'd be quite tricky. But, you know, so these sorts of things are more challenging. So there's going to be inherent risks in there. And I guess that's when you start getting into the discussions of, do we really want to, is it too expensive to make this building resilient? And therefore, actually, do we need to, I'm going to use the terrible word, get rid of it, to protect the portfolio? I think that's important. But there's a lot of things you can do. I think in new builds, you can build a lot more resilience indirectly into the asset. With existing buildings, it's going to become a little bit more of the managed scenario. You can only do so much. And water is the kind of real classic one, because keeping water out of a building is really hard. I mean, it always finds the smallest hole somewhere. And so to absolutely make sure every single inlet is protected is really, really challenging. And even then, the water finds a way over it, under it, around it, or whatever. So we talk about sort of dry proofing and wet proofing. Wet proofing, we're trying to keep the water out. Dry proofing is actually avoiding it to start with. So the new assets can take a dry proofing approach where we're staying away from the water. The existing assets are going to have to take a bit more of a wet proofing asset. But I think, you know, we do talk too much about the water side. We don't talk enough about the heat, the wind, and the cold side, which is, you know, associated with the envelope, its ability to withstand all of these temperature extremes. So we need to kind of probably focus a little bit more on some of that, understand some of those dynamics a little bit more.
Yeah.
In terms of action, I'd say we're not doing enough. I'll put it bluntly. I think we're very reactionary. We're not really thinking far enough ahead. We're still building new residential subdivisions in areas that are flood zones, you know, or exposed to bushfire risk and things like that. I think we really need to start shifting the mindset around, okay, and particularly for existing communities, you know, that are going to be at risk of future sea level rise, erosion, inundation. We actually need to be thinking more strategically about how we think about managed retreat, how we actually make that work. It's not a very acceptable policy in many places, because, you know, it has multiple ramifications socially, economically, the whole lot. But we really do need to start thinking about these things in real terms, because if we're waiting for the events to happen, it's too late. And where we are seeing, lots of action happening is usually because there has been some kind of event that has triggered, oh my goodness, this is a huge risk and it's probably going to get worse. So we need to take action on this.
Yep. I'd love to bring our audience into the conversation. Oh, we've got a question here from Lauren.
Laurie Kersey from Haven, so Boken Shopping Centres. I'm really interested in, you just said that events drive action, but we've seen plenty of events. If we take fire as a great example over the last even 5 years, yet there's a great project on the Northern Beaches. It's a new subdivision. It's proposed to go into areas of huge fire risk, but even the RFS have said, do not do it. Is it going to take mitigation upheld in the courts to actually make change when we can see fire as the example? The events of the last 5 years have not influenced that project whatsoever.
Yep.
And there would be more, not just one.
And I would definitely say, yes, more than likely it is going to take to that point, unfortunately, for that to happen. And it's going to happen at scale. So, I mean, there's already, we wrote a paper a number of years ago about, the continuous building in areas that are known at risk. Now, when we start looking at the contamination space for residential subdivisions and things like that, there's a leading landmark case in Victoria, the Brooklands Green. Now, proportionate liability was allocated to the developer, to the local council and the EPA for the decisions associated with that and the losses associated to the community that were impacted as a result of that. It is elements like that that actually set the precedent for future climate-related risks. If those risks are known and the approvals are still given to go ahead, and then something happens, that certainly, if you're looking at the case law and existing precedents, there is effectively an opportunity there. And unfortunately, I suspect it's probably going to take someone really kind of nailing this to actually really start driving reforms, particularly in the planning system, to really make sure that there's not going to be developments built in at-risk areas.
Yeah, we've just been through ASRS for our retirement living portfolio and discovered all the delightful risks lurking across 67 retirement villages, lots of flood and fire risk and, bushfire, the smoke inhalation. But one of the things I established when I did the Scape one and then the retirement living portfolio was that publicly available information is appalling, right? Or amazing in Brisbane for flood. Places where there have been big impacts have generally got on with trying to disclose that and make the public aware and make property owners aware. Northern Beaches, super highly exposed from coastal and river and fire. They've got an amazing online tool. City of Sydney, City of Melbourne, appalling. Like 7 PDFs, page 273, a granular PDF, zoom in to see a pixel, which maybe represents my property or doesn't. And is it light blue? Is it dark blue? Is that 1 meter? Is that 2? Like, appalling level of public information availability. Clearly, there's this massive information asymmetry in the market where some people have the money to pay to get the consultants who can give you the information, and the majority of people, the poor individual resident, is left at the mercy of whatever they can get from council and through the planning process. Like, how do we solve this at a state level and a federal level to get a consistent information base about the risks that, one of the most exposed, climate risk exposed countries on earth faces? Like, what's your view on this?
Well, from federal level, we do need to actually have a collective database that is modelling that across. At the moment, we've got very piecemeal actions, as you just pointed out, across the states, even down to that local government level. That doesn't necessarily help what's going on, but one of the biggest things that we did research on a few years ago was around disclosure. And so we examined, in Victoria, we have a Section 32 that has to go with every contract, which, albeit is probably, I don't know how many actually read it, but when you actually start matching that with property data and transactions and the implications around pricing, where there is information that is flagging that there is a risk, the market is pricing that in. Where there is no signals around the risk, it is not being priced in. And so that was quite clearly done in a study that we did in Victoria, in one of the local councils that's going to be subjected to sea level rise and also future flooding risk substantially. So it was kind of very much trying to highlight, it's not just the issue of what the flooding is right now, but how sea level rise will shift those flood levels in the future as well. And that's not being taken into account, particularly when you start thinking about the life cycle of ownership. But yes, disclosure, I think, is one of the biggest ones. And I mean, we still can't even get energy efficiency certifications in the residential sector, despite them agreeing to that in 1998, and the ACT were the only ones to actually implement it at point of sale or lease. But I'm assured that, we're going to see that policy actually really start taking some legs, hopefully, across all asset classes over the next few years.
I think Emma's got a question. I think Joanne after.
Yes, thank you. And maybe it's an extension of Chris's question in a way about information that's available, but more so maybe the interpretation of that existing information. We had a number of conversations with our insurance panel providers over the last number of months. And what was really interesting as part of that conversation was, we took them through the process that we've done around exposure, the adaptation strategies that we have in place, therefore our interpretation of inherent risk across our portfolio. They shared that they ran a number of clients' portfolios through various different existing data sets that are available in the market. And the result was wildly different interpretations of exposure. So they were quite interested in how we chose that data set, why we chose that particular one. And when you have insurance providers making a decision, and a very material decision on a portfolio and insurability risk on the back of one data set, you've got valuers in the rest of the market also pricing in risk based on another data set, and our interpretation will also be different. How do you see all of that evolving? And maybe you've partly answered the question in terms of policy. Policy can help solve for some of it, but it's clearly a challenge that is emerging that can have really material impacts in capital markets and transactions.
Yeah, I think the big one is the insurers are sitting on a wealth of information, particularly around loss claims and existing risks. They've got their future models as well. They have some of the best databases in the world. They keep these very closely guarded. But also you've got to remember that the insurers can walk away in 12 months' time because depending on your contract agreement, they're only insuring for, this next 12 months. So they'll be looking at, okay, well, what is the probability of these, events potentially happening in the next 12 months? And they're basing the premiums around that. Yes, they use a future forecasting model in terms of thinking about annual expected losses and how that drives the premium, but they're also making that decision around probability of these events happening right now within the next 12 months. Because in 12 months' time, if they're like, well, actually we're seeing quite an escalation everywhere, we're not going to insure that asset from now on, they can make that decision in 12 months' time. But when you own property, you've got to think about that across the life cycle of ownership. And the ramifications that if your asset suddenly does become uninsurable or the premiums become, ridiculous, what are you going to do? Because a lot of finance is also attached to the requirement to maintain insurance for the asset. So there's a lot of uncertainty and risk associated with, that relationship and that holding of information by the insurers going forward. And I think we really need to think seriously about how we're going to tackle that issue with hopefully more information being more publicly available.
Morning everyone, I'm Steve Mann from property developer Free City. The big banner over our industry where we're the laggard is productivity. So that means better, faster and more affordable. What does that mean for ESG? Where is the opportunities and where are the tensions?
Right, so the challenge is often the perception that ESG costs money. Now, in some cases it does, in other cases it's not. Sometimes it is actually just best practice. So there are so many different elements that go into making up what that ESG is, and I think it kind of comes back to the earlier comment of it is not just an ESG add-on. It is a complete spectrum in terms of what can be done. And I'm trying to communicate this to valuers all the time in terms of they just like putting in a nice ESG statement. We've considered it, it's implicitly considered in the value. That's not enough anymore. We actually need to be breaking down, okay, what are some of the core components that are driving different value shifts within and under that ESG banner? So I think the opportunities lie in, okay, well, where can we maximise the opportunities in terms of the value uplift? But that at the same time also needs a market to recognise what they are. And if they are just looking at, oh, it's got ESG, that's not going to be enough to actually drive and shift the needle.
Yeah, I concur with that. I mean, there's a lot of evidence out there that will say that an ESG, a sustainable building is going to get you a better return, which is a higher productivity for that asset. The people in that asset are going to have higher productivity, and the fund is going to perform and do better off an ESG related sustainable asset. So I don't see that it's in any way counter to highly productive, high performance assets, buildings, financial investments, whatever it might be. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they have to take longer to develop or cost more. I think it's about properly integrating it into that whole process, whole life cycle of the asset, from even the first thought of a building or an asset to the complete demolition of that asset. I think it supports the performance of that asset and therefore the productivity of that asset. I haven't ever seen any evidence of high performing assets causing less productivity.
Mm. You've also got to remember that, when we look across history and what is always driving that top end of the market, those price increases, the assets that everyone wants to hold, it is about having the best in class asset. And when we start thinking about what constitutes best in class asset now, sustainability is an underpinning factor of that. And so you'll see that trickle down, as we go over, the next 20, 30 years of our careers, we will see that will continue to progress, and that there will be another wave of, okay, well, what is going to be the next kind of, best in class kind of trend that we're going to see within the market. And I think it's a continuum. It's not just a, have or have not.
Great. I think we've got one more question from Joanne here.
Joanne Gamble from Lendlease. We're talking about, I feel like a lot of conversations about the physical climate risk. I'd be interested to know how you're seeing transitional risk being factored in valuations, and in particular, assets that are very fossil fuel dependent. Are they actually being affected by valuations in any way? I guess I'm going to say I'm not seeing increase in value of electric buildings as per se. And so I'd just be interested to see if there is a trend, if that needle is moving yet.
Well, there's a lot of work still to do with decarbonising assets, whether it's electrification or actually the fuller decarbonisation process around all of the fossil fuel aspects. I think there is a lot of work to do, and I think there's probably so few of those really decarbonised assets to really understand what the value proposition of it is. I mean, we've shared with quite a few people across the industry already some of our research around the desire to occupy, high performing decarbonised assets. There's a huge demand for it. There's a massive lack of supply. So there's something there around value.
I just don't know if people are going to pay. I know that sounds harsh, but yeah.
But it's not necessarily about just paying. There's multiple things. When you think about it from a valuation perspective, it's actually about having tenants in the building too, which when you've got pent-up demand can actually be a trigger that can actually enable, that asset to suddenly end up fully tenanted rather than having a 30% vacancy. Like, we're in vacancy rate territory, albeit it's a bit more nuanced when you, zoom down to local areas and submarkets within CBDs. We haven't seen vacancy rates at these levels since the 90s office crash. We've got incentives at the highest level they've been since that time as well. So, there's a lot of opportunity in terms of thinking about, okay, well, how do I make sure I've got tenants in my building? And I think there are other nuances just rather than, are they going to pay a higher rent, that is going to be factored into these decisions. Now, to point it out from a valuation perspective, you're probably not going to see a valuer going, it's an electrified asset, so, we're going to adjust this. There's not enough evidence in the market there yet to actually prove that point, but also you'll find that it'll be implicitly there in other kind of elements. And so that's kind of where we start seeing those shifts, and the valuers, need to consider the asset as a whole. And so it's a bundle of characteristics, not just, a single kind of isolated aspect that they're going to go, I need to adjust my base, yield by, 25 basis points because X. That takes a really long time.
It seems like a real laggard. Sorry, no offense. Like, that the valuations have got.
Yes, they are, because they're backwards looking, and they're required to, basically, because they all got sued in the 90s. So yeah, they do have to look at backwards. They have to have the evidence. They can, and like this is one of the challenges around looking at future climate risks and things like that, is that they're not actually allowed to future forecast. Okay, yes, we do a discounted cash flow that looks, 10 years into the future, but we've got to have the evidence already today to actually put what we think is happening in that DCF. So that's what makes some of these elements quite challenging from their perspective, is that we've got to have the evidence today, because if we get taken to court, we've got to demonstrate where that evidence is, and it's not enough to kind of say, well, based on, this trend or that, we've got to have the evidence in hand to say this is what we identified and this is why we made those decisions in the valuation.
It'll be interesting considering that partly with ASRS, many of us are being encouraged to future forecast our risks.
And I think this will actually help that decision making, because if all of the stakeholders in the market start actually going, well, we are considering all of these risks and we are, tangibly making decisions based on this, then the valuers do need to reflect it. So it's a little bit kind of circular, and I think that is how climate risk and those future considerations will be taken into account in valuations, is when it starts being very clearly signalled within the market around what's happening and why decisions are being made. And the ASRS is a really helpful step in the right way of really being able to kind of hone in on the importance of that. It's now we just need stakeholders to be quite clear about why some of those decisions are being made.
There's certainly increased transparency around this stuff, and we're seeing through rating tools, for example. So with Green Star Performance in its new version, and I'm hearing this frequently now, that, with the requirements of the new rating tools, if you have a 5-year-old premium grade office building with a gas boiler in the basement, you won't get that 6-star rating anymore. So I think it's increasingly challenging to hide that sort of carbon exposure as well, and other frameworks like CREM. It's increasingly, you need to be on that kind of decarbonisation, electrification pathway. So I think that level of transparency is, hopefully that will be picked up in valuations as well. And
Fingers crossed.
Yeah.
I mean, for those in the room who haven't heard me kind of bat on about this for the last 12 months or 24 months, the International Valuation Standards actually incorporated the reporting of sustainability and ESG into our valuation standards. So it directed valuers that they now need to collect data on this. They need to be explicit around the risks and opportunities that the ESG characteristics of the asset present. They then need to consider and compare those when they're considering the comparables, which kind of underpins everything that we do. So that evidence base. And then whether it has a material impact. So that is a very slow process in terms of getting the valuers to understand this new world effectively for them in terms of how they go about this. Because before it was kind of just, it's all implicit. We know that they've got those characteristics, but it's implicitly, blended in. The IVS point to this was very much around making this explicit rather than it just being a glib implicit kind of consideration. And that the IVS governs everything beyond real assets as well. So everything from infrastructure, companies, assets, liabilities, the whole lot. So it's not just a unique thing to the real estate sector. But from the valuation fraternity perspective, this is like a super curve in terms of them having to adapt their knowledge and build their knowledge around these aspects and what constitutes these factors. Because probably what I've heard the most over the last year, my building doesn't have a green certification, so I don't need to worry about this. And it's like, no, that's not how it works. So, having to get that message across to the valuers, and that's everyone from your residential valuer, doing the mortgage based valuations to the very top end of town who are doing massive portfolios. Everyone's, on this journey of having to build that knowledge capability and understand what are the relevant and most significant factors for their particular market and their sector. And that's quite nuanced.
Maybe if I can just put one last question to you. I don't want to keep us I'll get in trouble from Jeff if I keep you too long. If we look 10, 15 years into the future with what we know now, what does good look like in terms of a truly climate resilient portfolio? What are some elements that you think will make a truly climate resilient portfolio?
From an asset level, which is where I sit, I mean, a great portfolio is going to have a great set of assets in it, and those assets are going to be able to demonstrate their resilience to climate change and the mitigation factors that are built in, both physically and, as I said, from a management perspective as well. So the portfolio managers will be kind of part of that. The asset managers, everybody has a role to play in that resilience piece. I think we will see buildings that perhaps look a little different to maybe what we've seen to date, because they need to manifest in a slightly different way to be resilient. I mean, how do you protect yourself from heat? You put shading on the building, you increase insulation, you reduce glass levels, you make that building more resilient to temperature extremes. It's designed for a 40-degree ambient, not a 32-degree ambient like a lot of the buildings around here, because we already see 32 regularly, way more than the 2.5% that is designed for. So some of that stuff will be sort of hidden away around the design criteria and that, but we will see them look a little different. They won't have the infrastructure in the basements; they'll have it in the upper floor, in the upper floors. They will be electrified assets, so they may have different plant arrangements, different configurations, because that equipment works best with different arrangements of base building plant and things. So I think we'll see a bit of a new generation of buildings which use some of the wonderful technologies that are coming on stream. What we see today with heat pump technology is probably a small amount of what is going to become possible with these machines and with all of the other systems. And to some extent, maybe even going back to some of the systems we've seen in the past. This stuff's a little bit kind of fashionable at times. But I'd like to think that the buildings will actually look different, because they need to look different to protect themselves from those physical events and constraints. We're dealing with climate, and the skin is the first protection against climate. So something's got to change.
And I think what we will see and I'm going to look at it from a value perspective, and because I'm a valuer, but it's going to be, I think we're going to see a bifurcation in the market, and effectively you're going to have the assets that have, transitioned, are resilient, and you're going to see those, being very featured quite prominently, and then you're going to have quite a significant value differential in the assets that are not. Now that may not be completely achievable within a 15-year timeframe, but if we look over history and we look at other technological shifts and changes, so everything from when we put elevators into buildings to air conditioning, to the technology, although that one's a bit more of a blur across a couple of decades, you start seeing significant value shifts. And you've got the haves and the have-nots. And I think we're already starting to see that within our market here in Australia, even around simple elements like our neighbours' certification elements. We are starting to see, assets being discounted for not achieving a particular expectation of the market. And I think that will just be amplified as we start moving into this world where we've got climate risks consideration, resilience measures, and how they best adapt. Because tenants and occupiers are not going to stay in assets where they're continually put at risk from their perspective. It's a social risk, it's an economic risk, it's a business interruption risk. They're not going to be staying in assets that are, despite how cheap their rent might be, they're not going to stay there. So they're going to keep moving to where they're going to find safety effectively. And then that's going to have flow-on effects from the ownership perspective in terms of, okay, well, how do we actually ensure that, this is not happening to our assets? I think some of our biggest challenges are going to be in some of the world's biggest cities around what do we do about some of this. And this may actually, drive where we need more collective action from owners, from government, from the community per se, to actually think about protection measures. So there's a lot of discussion, and I know I'm going off tangent here, but that the government will solve all of our problems. That the government will step in and they'll build the big seawall around, the entire city, and we'll be safe. We'll dam the heads in Melbourne and, protect the city kind of thing. That's putting a lot of expectation on a future government who may not necessarily have the income to actually support those kinds of initiatives. So, yeah, we need to start really thinking more broadly around how we create collective change.
Yeah. Well, we have a lot of asset managers in the room, so hopefully, that was a really great discussion. Thank you so much for your insights, and thank you for your questions from the floor. It was a really great discussion and conversation. Hopefully that will ease us into day 2 of Transform. So thank you again to JLL and Georgia and Julian for joining us this morning. Thank you.
Thank you.